Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Deb Fuster and I'm the Manager of Advocacy and Engagement at the Victorian Council of Social Service, otherwise known as VCOSS. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And as I'm sure you are already experiencing, it's a very busy time in housing policy reform. Of course, the big housing build has commenced and the 10-year strategy for social and affordable housing will be launched later this year, both of which will significantly change the social housing sector in Victoria for years to come. More broadly, many of the housing accessibility and affordability issues that existed long before the pandemic continue to persist. And for some communities, these issues have worsened as COVID continues to impact the way that we live. And I just want to acknowledge that as I say that, I'm very aware that we have the Premier and Health Minister and Chief Health Officer delivering a press conference as we speak. So I just want to acknowledge the, that this is a really difficult time for all of us in Victoria right now. So thank you for making the time to join us today when so much is going on. But back to the housing reform space, the long-awaited rent reforms under the Residential Tenancies Act came into effect in March this year, and I'm sure many of you have gathered insights around how renters have been impacted by these reforms. But even with those rental fairness reforms in place, we know that for many of the people that you support, social housing is the best, and for some, the only housing option that is affordable and secure. And so in this context, it's really timely and necessary that the government want to review the regulatory regime for social housing to ensure that the regulation supports renters' wellbeing and housing security, while ensuring, of course, the sustainability of the sector. So in this session today, which VCOSS is really pleased to be bringing together for you, I'm pleased to be joined by the independent panel leading the review, Dr. David Hayward, a panel chair, Dr. Heather Holst, another panel member, and Dr. David Cousins also. And we also have the review director joining us, Angelina Blanicelli, sorry. Before I invite the panel to speak to you all, I'll just tell you about the Q&A session that will take place after their presentation in case you think of a question during the presentation. So essentially the way that it will work is that you can submit a question at any time through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will moderate the questions just so that we can cover a wide range of topics. We'll get through as many questions as possible, but we might not get to all of them. So we'll take unanswered questions on notice and we will follow them up for you. So there will be some email information provided to you after today's event. We'll also ask you to do a quick exit survey that will pop up in your browser at the end of the event, and that will also include an opportunity for you to provide direct feedback to the panel. So thanks in advance for your input. So we're going to get stuck in. So it's my pleasure to hand over to David Hayward, the chair of the independent panel leading the Social Housing Regulation Review. And as I mentioned, David will be joined by his colleagues, Dr. Heather Holst and Dr. David Cousins. So I'm going to switch my camera off and mute myself and hand over to the expert panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deb, and pleasure to be here with you all. I see that we have over 70 participants, which is really fantastic. We're delighted to see that. I'm in Boonwurrung country in southeast Victoria today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge that the land has never been ceded. It's my pleasure to be with you today as the chair of this panel, in the process of putting together the materials for this, some of the discussion papers that we put out. We've commissioned an international review of social housing settings in other countries, and one of the things that came out of that review was that for probably about a 30-year period, 20 or 30-year period in Australia, by virtue of government decisions not to invest in social housing, that's public housing or community housing, we've effectively de facto decided to grow private rental housing as the main alternatives for people in precarious employment situations or with disadvantages, multiple disadvantages. And that growth of the private rental sector has been accompanied by a lack of oversight of the conditions. So people get rent assistance, landlords get negative gearing and other tax advantages, but there's actually very little oversight of the conditions under which people live. All that's changed, of course, in Victoria through the decision by the state government to invest in a big housing builder, $5 billion plus in affordable and social housing. If there's one thing that I can say that we have as a consensus from the submissions to us, people are saying this is a fantastic thing that Victoria has done, and they'd like to see other states in the federal government follow that lead. So well done to the state of Victoria. By investing all that money into social housing, social and affordable housing, the state government has issued another challenge, and that is, are the regulatory settings appropriate? Do we need to change them? Should we be thinking about new settings? I guess all of that in turn raises questions about what do we mean by regulation? It's a technical term, regulation, and it's one of those terms that tends to put people to sleep rather than wake them up. And if there's one thing that's become clear to regulators is that language matters. I just read this morning the Essential Services Commission's latest report on fairness. And one of the things they're emphasising is the importance of having language that all people can understand as a regulator. And I think that makes sense. And it's an interesting segue for me, because one of the things that we've decided to do is to try and set up a system that sees tenants looked after, the centrepiece of the regulatory environment. I think for a long time we've been confused about our settings, and we have been confused between should tenants be at the centre of the regulatory setting, should we be thinking about what conditions would enable private investment to take place, how can we make sure that public monies are invested wisely, and tenants have tended to take the back seat. What we're keen to do is push them to the front of the consideration. But in doing this regulatory review, what we're more interested in than anything is your views about what the regulatory setting should be. And if you're a tenant of social housing or waiting to get into social housing, we really welcome your views, and of course providers, but we're particularly interested in tenants' views. Now, with that introduction behind me, I will now pass over to Angelina, who's heading up the Secretariat of the review. What is the Secretariat? Well, the Secretariat are the public servants that do the heavy lifting for the review. They do all the research, do the papers, do that work, and it's a very impressive team. And Angelina is the director of the Secretariat, and she's got a short presentation for you, after which we'll move to a question and answer session. So over to you, Angelina.
Thank you, David. I'm just trying to get my camera working. Okay, everyone see that okay, that screen? Thumbs up. Thank you. So before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today, and pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm also meeting on the lands of the Bunurong people. And I also want to thank Emma and everyone at VCOSS for hosting this meeting, and everyone here for your interest in the review. As Deb said, my name's Angelina Iannuccelli. I'm the director of the Review Secretariat, which has been conducted for the Victorian Government by an independent panel, as we've heard from David, also Dr. Heather Holst and Dr. David Cousins. So the panel starting point is sorry about that, just getting the visuals right, for the review is, as David said, that the social housing system exists to serve the interests of tenants, and so should the regulatory arrangements. First, I wanted to talk a bit about what we mean by regulation, and David touched on it really briefly. And yes, most people do think of legislation and rules in acts of Parliament, and it is that. But it's also a whole range of other informal and formal influences on the way things work. So you know that government policy and funding decisions, contracts with government, departmental policies and procedures, and also decisions of courts and tribunals that feed into those rules and regulations. And just for some extra context, in Australia over the past 3 or 4 decades, as many of you probably know, the creation of these regulatory systems has come about as we've moved in a whole range of sectors from a public provision of services where there's a single public provider into a model where there's one or more private providers, and regulation has been set up to try to achieve the same public outcomes from that privatisation. So this is, if you think about everything from utilities, essential services, energy, David mentioned, university education, casinos, aged care, roads and transport all fit into that category. And what we've also seen is that this model is often imperfect, and getting the regulation right is very difficult, and it's failed in a lot of cases, and we're seeing many of those at the moment. In our social housing system over the past few decades, we've seen the move from a single government provider, public housing provider, to still the single public provider, but with many smaller providers. And this system is very much in transition still now. The big housing bill is going to give some impetus to that. So there's a need, especially now, to review how regulation works, and this is a task in front of the panel. Today, I'm going to outline some of the big issues and ideas so far, and invite you to respond to those and to ask the panel questions about things that interest you. And I'll just note that there's a couple of things that are outside the scope of the review. And they're things like funding for social housing, and other services, and setting rent levels and other government policy decisions like that. So some of the issues that the panel's heard so far this year in moving around the state have been that there's inequities in the system for tenants. So thinking about tenants in public housing, tenants in social housing, and tenants outside the social housing system who need social housing, the services and mechanisms that are available to them depending on their provider. The system can often be unclear and complex to navigate for tenants, but the system has become quite focused on providers, and there's not enough focus on what tenants want and need. So housing assistance isn't well integrated with other support services. Thinking about support services that are available to people before they gain a tenancy, maybe if they're in homelessness, to when after they've gained a tenancy. Also those pathways from crisis accommodation, transitional to permanent accommodation. And so there's scope for better integration there. Building quality, environmental safety standards could be stronger. There's no provision for cultural safety in our social housing system. And that's particularly relevant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tenants. There's scope for stronger transparency and accountability amongst providers for the service and performance and the services that they provide to tenants, basically. And thinking about the very vulnerable and complex tenant group that our social housing system is set up for, there's scope for staff to be better equipped to deal with that tenant group. Some of the ideas that the panel's been exploring, and some of these ideas are in our first consultation paper, thinking about those equity issues and the inconsistencies across systems, bringing the social housing system into a single regulatory umbrella, so public and community housing providers, but also maybe some non-social housing providers I'll talk about in a second. Introducing a customer charter, some high-level principles that providers sign up to about what they will deliver and commit to for their clients, for their tenants, and embedding tenant input and voice into regulation, and a customer charter would be a great way to do that. As I said, supporting the social housing workforce to deal with that diverse tenant base that can help the staff in the sector, and also help achieve those positive outcomes that regulation also is aiming and should be set up to achieve. And of course, ensuring cultural safety across the system. As I mentioned briefly before, and David also mentioned at the beginning, one of the things the panel is keen to point out is that not all social tenants or people who are eligible for social housing or need social housing actually live in social housing. And this is a diagram from our background paper, and it shows that about 20% of people who nationally need social housing are actually living in public and community housing. And the numbers are based on estimates, but those other 80% there are people who are eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance, or often living in unsuitable accommodation for them. So how could regulation be put in place that makes housing work for everyone in a system where at the moment, it's an essential service and it arguably doesn't work for everyone, and it needs to work for everyone. And that sort of raises questions about could certain providers outside the social housing system be asked to sign up to a social housing, social landlord type charter? And there's complexities with that, but how could you not ask that question? And thinking about the Residential Tenancies Act, we're aware that a review, and as Deb mentioned, those reforms that have come into place, they're very good reforms. Arguably, the Residential Tenancies Act doesn't work for vulnerable and disadvantaged tenants. But having said that, significant changes to the review aren't envisaged. And you're welcome to ask more about that during the question and answer session. We just quickly, before I wrap up and give you some time for question and answers, we've got a consultation paper coming out in a couple of weeks' time, which will ask some more questions around the settings for providers, and are they right in order to support that healthy, successful sector over time. And there's some of the questions there that paper will ask. So, oh, sorry, Deb.
No, that's okay. I wasn't sure if you were finishing. Sorry, keep going.
I was just letting people have a look at those, but this is the last slide, and this is just letting you know how you can get involved in the review. We are calling for submissions, but want to make clear to everyone that you're able to participate in any way you like. So the consultation papers are quite formal, but we're open to receiving comments and emails about any issue that you want to let us know about or ask about. Our email address is there, and there's also, you can do that via the Engage page. There's also some great resources on our website that you can use to communicate with your clients, and really encourage you to do that. And there's also some client surveys and on the website as well that you can use to get people involved. And the panel's really keen to to hear from clients and actual users of service in this review rather than just representatives and providers. So really encourage people to do that if you can. So that brings me to the end, and I'll hand back to Deb.
Great. Thank you so much, Angelina. That was a really good overview for everyone. And thanks, David, as well, for those foundational comments that you made also. So it is a real privilege to have all three panel members with us today, as well as Angelina. So now is the time to throw to our audience for questions to the panel. Just a reminder, please submit these via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And as we said, if there's anything that we need to come back to you with information offline, we will be communicating with an email that wraps all of this content up post the event. So just to kick off to our panel members, one of the questions that's come through is there's a bit of an emphasis as well on, regulatory and reporting burden. Is the panel able to share any insights about the regulatory or reporting burden you're seeking to improve for community housing providers?
Yeah, look, let me take that one, Deb. And also, I forgot to mention, thank you so much to VCOSS for holding today's forum. That was a terrific initiative, and we really do appreciate it. A big thank you to Emma King for making it possible. VCOSS is really having a golden period at the moment, and we do really appreciate your help. So regulatory burden is an issue that's come up, but it's been interesting talking to providers about what's meant by regulatory burden. And for example, some people have said, well, we've got a national system, we've got a state-based system. For those providers that are operating across state borders, maybe the regulatory burden is too much. And talking to those providers, they've said, well, no, that's probably not the big issue for us. The big issue is programmatic funding and the reporting that goes with providing services across so many programs, and it might be here and interstate. That's where the big regulatory burden comes from. But in saying that, one of the things we are conscious of is wanting to make sure that things are simplified and there's not duplication. So we've been looking at things. Look, if, say, just as an example, if things are covered off in contracts already, well, as long as the contract management is good and the regulator is confident that the contracts are being managed well, maybe the regulator doesn't have to start duplicating that information too. So it is something we're conscious of, but what we don't want to, what we want to do obviously is get the balance right.
Fantastic, thank you. Now this next question is quite a long one, so I'll just, I've got a tendency to speak very fast, and so our friends who do the Auslan interpreting always tell me to slow it down, so I will just try and slow myself down as I ask this question. So it's around the national regulatory system for community housing, and I guess the alignment with what's happening in Victoria. So the question is, are the tenant and housing services performance standards available on the National Regulatory System for Community Housing and published by the Registrar in Victoria appear to be word for word the same? And so the question is, what are the key differences between the national scheme and the Victorian scheme that the panel considers might impact service delivery to renters that submitters should consider putting a view on?
I'm happy for one of the other panelists to answer that if they'd like to. David or Heather, would you like to? Oh, you're on mute, David.
My apologies. Happy to say a few words about that, and maybe Heather can pick up. There are some differences, significant differences between the national scheme and the Victorian scheme, particularly perhaps in relation to who the schemes cover. For example, the national scheme incorporates the possibility of for-profit providers being registered, and there's also a different tiered structure in the national scheme. The national scheme actually covers, has a tier 3 level attached to it, which incorporates a number of smaller not-for-profit organisations, for example, Aboriginal incorporated bodies. So So the differences there with the national scheme are, I think, more, there are some other differences in terms of the powers of the regulator. The Victorian regulator has stronger powers than the national scheme has. So those are all things that we're concerned to look at. I think the consistency nationally is a very important thing, where we've got a sector which is growing and there is more interstate activity happening, and we don't want to unduly restrain that. But at the same time, we do need a regulator, I think, that's attuned to the local situation. So those are some of the questions we're looking at.
I'll just make one additional comment, which is where we're trying to work with the question of what would it take for Victoria to join the national system, because it does strike us as odd that it's just Victoria and WA who stand outside it. So I wanted to assure everybody that that's the approach. But you know, we won't recommend joining it without very full consideration of the sort of special features in Victoria that David's just outlined, and why they, you know, what it would take for Victoria to join. We think Victoria would have some powers to ask for some changes in order to join as well. Be a couple of comments I'd make to that one.
Yeah, if I could just add one other thing, Deb. It's interesting that there's just been a review of the NERSH, and the review, one of the things it highlighted was the need to make it more tenant focused, that tenants didn't have a strong enough role in it. And then when the recommendation finally came out on the recommended reform path, the tenant reform proposals, which would see tenants be moved a bit more central to the regulatory structure, that they were knocked off and felt not to be important. And from my perspective, that indicates an underdeveloped national framework that needs some work to be done. So I think that from my perspective, not necessarily the panels, but before we would recommend a move towards a national system, I would really much like to see that national system more tenant focused, the language made more understandable, and also some of the measures considered. So there's some important things that aren't part of the thinking at the moment. And so they're all part and parcel, but David did talk about that there is a assumption, and it's a reasonable one, that all things considered, if we had one really good system, that would be probably better than having lots of them.
Thank you. That's a really comprehensive response. It's great to have the kind of rich perspective and expertise that each of the three panel members bring. So thank you. The next question is a question about the scope of the review. And the question is, why is rent setting out of scope for the review, but other issues such as the concept of new protections for renters outside the social housing system, so social tenants, have been introduced to the scope? And the comment there is, when rent setting is such a key issue for current and future tenants, the reasoning for this seems opaque to the person who's asking the question.
A really good question. Heather, would you like to have a shot first up? And I'm happy to chip in.
The first thing I'd say is, if you think that's your main issue and the most important issue, write to us about it. But we don't want to misrepresent the powers of this review. So I noticed a couple of other questions about scope, or maybe one other in the Q&A too. So if you write to us with your biggest issues, basically. So let me say that up front. Questions of rent setting are policy questions that are kind of government policy, and they also then tend to get kind of built in to projects, because projects are financed on the basis of the amount of rent that is expected to be derived. And as we know, it takes a long time to pay off projects. And so these things do get built in, unless there's top-up money comes through from another source, usually government. Those decisions are made and stay for quite a while. So that would be a couple of remarks I'd make, mainly that it is government policy type basis. The regulator can make sure that that policy is being well followed by individual providers, but we didn't want to misrepresent what our powers were in this matter.
Thanks for that, Heather. David?
David, did you want to add anything?
Well, I completely agree with what Heather had said. I guess our review is focused on on the regulatory issues, and there is a bigger issue in terms of this policy and strategy, if you like, of government in this area. There's this 10-year strategy review that's happening. And I think it's really trying to ensure that we don't stray too far away from the regulatory issues that we've said, that, you know, we're not really looking closely at the issue about rentals. But having said that, I think there is always scope for us to look at issues that people raise with us. And so I just, you know, again, urge people, if there are particular issues about the way rental setting happens and the differences between public and community, whatever it might be, please do raise them with us.
Thank you to the panel members for that. There was a question that I was going to ask next, but I think that it's been well addressed, which is one of our audience members has asked just for a bit more commentary about what is in and what is in and what is out of scope. The comment is, I'm concerned my future submissions may include advice that's out of scope. So what I'm hearing from the panel members is, you know, clarity from the panel around, you know, what's in your remit, like what you've got the power to kind of influence, but saying that if something is really a burning issue for one of the anyone who wants to engage with this review process, it's not a waste of time canvassing that in a submission. The panel will look at that, but you are realistic and very pragmatic around what is actually in your remit. I'm not sure if you wanted to comment further on that at all.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Deb. So that's the answer. One of the things we have to be careful of is trying to put a boundary around what is actually pretty tricky, and the grey areas are all over the place. So, for example, just even on the rent setting issue, people might submit around cost rents versus market rents. They might submit around all sorts of things. There's certain things that we really can't venture into. Should it be wholly public housing? Should there be community housing? Probably not an issue that we can really deal with as a regulatory review, because they're policy questions for government. So we're trying to kind of set a boundary up, but by all means, give us your advice, because that's what we're here for while we're putting these papers out. And it may be that somebody writes to us and says, hey, we think that you've got it wrong, you should be doing this. We'd be very happy to take that advice on board and give it full consideration.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Another question about scope, and this one is really quite specific. So, and this is from our colleague Jen at Women with Disabilities Victoria. So the question is that the panel mentioned that quality and safety are in scope. And the specific question is disability access in scope? The comment is, this is topical as we see the state building dwellings with steps when steps are not required in new builds on empty sites.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the areas I think we're likely to be turning our attention to as we think about what the new system should look like is something around safety generally. So as an example, we've had submission from Fire Rescue Victoria pointing out the disproportionate number of fire-related deaths in public housing, social housing. If you look at the regulations governing fire standards in Victoria, strangely, they're silent pretty much on dwellings that are, or structures that are less than 3 stories. And the requirements are actually not very onerous, and they certainly don't protect tenants. The Disability Act is a terribly important issue that, yes, we would love to hear you talk about. So things like that would be most welcome. There are very clear gaps in the regulatory framework at the moment on what's measured and what's not. So that would be, we would welcome that kind of submission.
That's terrific to hear, and we know that WDV and others in this space will have a wealth of knowledge to share with the panel. The next question is from our colleague Natalie at Tenants Victoria. Natalie's asking, how does the panel see its work improving renter choice? The comment is, at the moment, due to lack of social housing supply, renters are in a take it or leave it situation. What additional transparency from community housing providers and public housing does the panel see to help renters?
That might be a good one for you to respond to.
Hi, Natalie. How you going? Thanks, David. So I think that the transparency issue, so that you can get good comparable information about the different providers, is going to be one of the big kind of directions that we recommend. I mean, you're completely right that the supply issues for trying to get social housing in the area you need, of the size you need, and all the other things with the scarcity, remains a problem as we speak now. I mean, we're going to be recommending the building of a system that we hope will last for quite a long time. And we've had one big investment announcement now with the big housing build. I mean, we're all optimists, so we wouldn't work in this area. So hopefully there'll be more big announcements like that, and that scarcity factor could come off to some extent. And then different perspectives then on choice might come into it. But I think my answer, Natalie, would be mainly that transparency, so people are as well informed as possible about their options, is probably the best approach at this point.
Great, thank you, David Hayward or David Cousins. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that at all?
Just as a related issue is the language that's used. I think it would be really helpful for us to be putting our mind to what's the language that makes all of that material that's as transparent as possible to as wide an audience as possible, rather than what we tend to do in policy is that the experts tend to design concepts which only experts genuinely understand. So we would hope to make things much more accessible to a much broader range of people. And remember, the way we've designed our social housing system is that we've almost got, I think it's 98% of new lets are going to priority tenants in pretty extreme circumstances. Raises another interesting issue that was at the front end of that question around, I guess, the power of tenants. They're pretty powerless. And if it's last resort housing, and the next step, if you do get evicted, is potentially homelessness, what position, bless you, what position are you in? What position are you in to genuinely have a choice? So those things are active in our consideration. Yep.
Thank you. The next question is from Michelle at Inner Melbourne Community Legal, and the question relates to discussion paper 2. So Michelle writes that discussion paper 2 suggests that Homes Victoria is largely responsible for regulating itself. And Michelle is just asking or commenting, this seems a bit confusing given government agency is accountable to Parliament, etc., and tenancy conditions are regulated by enforceable policies and procedures of Homes Vic. So the question is, how is regulation understood in this context?
David, would you like to have a shot at that one? David Cousins, would you like to have a shot at answering?
Oh, okay. It's always a question of degree, isn't it? And yes, there are those external accountability mechanisms which apply to the public provider. The possibility of an Auditor General's review, an Ombudsman review. They happen fairly infrequently. But aside from that, Homes Vic is pretty much determines the policies. And in that sense, I think that was the reference that Homes Vic is sort of determining its own directions, if you like. It's not the case that there's an independent regulator oversighting Homes Vic, as there is, for example, with the community housing agencies. So that is one issue that the review is looking at, whether, as was mentioned previously, whether or not there should be some sort of independent regulatory oversight over Homes Vic, as there is under other social housing providers.
Thank you. Now, the next question is from one of our regional Victorian members, do a lot of work on the support side of things, and they are kind of qualifying the question by saying they're not sure if it's the forum to ask the question or whether the question is out of scope, but I think it's really important to probably get that answer either way. If it is out of scope, we can then assist someone, the person asking the question, to follow up in another forum. But the question is will there be clarity and notice regarding the impact of funding to support agencies, i.e. outcome-based funding?
Look, we'd welcome submissions on that topic. The difficulty is with outcomes-based funding, which is the holy grail of social policy, is that in social policy, it's really, really hard to get outcomes measures because of the interdependencies. And in fact, social housing is a really good example with so many tenants being priority tenants. They interact with multiple government agencies. So you've got the housing provider, probably the education department, possibly the justice department. You've got multiple agencies all claiming a little bit of the action, and it's very difficult to work out who it is that you would ultimately put the outcome down to. And you do have to be careful about assuming that it's easy to develop those kind of things. But we would welcome any suggestions around that, or what kind of measures might be useful to be thinking about. But just with that important caveat that it's very, very difficult to come up with an agreed system of outcome measures for social housing.
Thank you. Now, the next question, and as I asked this question, I was thinking about that really terrific diagram that Angelina had up, which was extracted from one of the discussion papers, which just shows the different places and spaces in which social tenants live. This is a question again about scope, and it's about semi and independent living accommodation. So the question is more semi and independent living accommodation for young people, young adults who have a case plan with NDIS part of the review?
Look, I might just answer that one too. What we've tried to do with the review, in fact, it picks up a question that was raised by somebody earlier. Why are we broadening the scope of the review to put our mind to people waiting to come into social housing? If you look at that graphic we just referred to, I think it's one of the best graphics we've come up with, because what it shows is that just a distinct minority of people that should be covered are currently covered by the social housing regulations. Now, if you've got a situation where Commonwealth and states are not investing in social housing, more and more people who are in need and eligible for social housing aren't in it, and they do not have the regulatory oversight. So what we're posing the question is that should we be considering all people who are, for example, on the social housing register, effectively, whether they're in social housing or they're waiting to get in, and that includes, for example, the homeless. Now, if we set that up as a criteria, that shifts attention away from that historical emphasis on the provider, right? So instead of going, let's look at the public housing agency or look at the community housing agencies, let's put our mind to all of the other providers who are benefiting from public subsidy, but are currently overlooked by the regulatory framework. To come back to this particular question, so if it's NDIS housing, that could get picked up as part of the new regulatory structure. We haven't made a decision about it, but what we're putting our mind to, if those people are on the social housing register, then yes, maybe the regulator should take them into consideration. That's why that's such a good question. You know, we've had rapid growth in all sorts of accommodation at the bottom end of the private housing market. They've been exempt from any kind of proper regulatory oversight, and this is an opportunity for us to correct that imbalance. It need not be total from day one, but it could be that the minister, for example, puts on notice of all providers that over the next 5 years, attention will turn in that direction. And it might be that as a first cut, what's required is that if you're housing somebody on the social housing register, you need to have somebody who's at least done some training on those tenants, so you know how to work with them, rather than just taking for granted assumptions and making their lives more difficult.
Thanks for that, David. I think the other thing that really strikes VCOSS in the way the panel is approaching the work, and more broadly Homes Victoria, the work they're doing as well, is really ensuring that you know, tenants are at the centre of a lot of this. So not just the kind of policy making, the regulator, but actually every kind of it's you know, building as much kind of co-design in as possible with tenants. The next question that we have is opens up with a comment and then a question. So the vulnerability of social renters, so financial and other vulnerability, increases the difficulties for renters to challenge decisions of their rental provider. Additional advocacy supports or tenant voice are unlikely to rectify this. What additional measures are the panel considering to right this power imbalance?
That's a terrific question. David, would you like to address that one? I'm happy to follow up, and Heather, you'll probably have some thoughts on it too.
Yeah, I don't, well, I think it's a question, as David said, it's central to what we're considering actually, but and it's certainly an area that we sort of welcome feedback, comment from people. We have looked at some of the tenant involvement, empowerment, if you like, approaches that we've seen in, say, United Kingdom, England, Scotland, and Wales, and some really impressive sort of work, I think, done in some of those jurisdictions in terms of sort of involving tenants more actively, giving tenants more collective power, ensuring there are policies, procedures and so on, which are influencing the way providers are dealing with tenants in these sort of circumstances. So it's not really sort of directly commenting on the specifics of the issue that you raise, but it certainly is something that's still very much in our scope.
I'd just follow up what David's saying there by saying that, you know, I hope that a lot of social housing tenants who do go ahead and raise an issue, you know, do find that they're not, I don't know, what would you say, you know, that it isn't as personal as it is with private rental, and that they actually, it all depends on, you know, what the policies are and what the law is and what the regulation is, and they should be able to get a good outcome. I appreciate that that's not a simple process, and that advocates are really important in that, as well as clarity from the provider and a general stance from the provider that feedback and helping, you know, positively responding to complaints is a good thing. But if you're, I think this one might be from Natalie again, you know, if you're seeing things that are systemically stopping people from exercising their rights in social housing, please tell us what you think would get around that, because this is the moment to be contemplating all that stuff. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The next question returns us just to an earlier part of the conversation around national regulation versus Victorian regulation. So the comment is picking up on the panel's desire to see a single comprehensive national regulatory scheme and the opportunity to make improvements to the national scheme. The question is, would this include strengthening the national regulator to be as strong as the Victorian regulator, which you indicated has stronger powers?
That's a very interesting question. I think we haven't really got, it's something that we certainly could consider, but we haven't really just had any discussions around that yet. I think what we're still working on is what might a really good system look like, and then looking at using that to compare with the national one, and then making recommendations, and maybe some minimal recommendations as to what would need to be picked up in order for Victoria to join that system. Heather and David, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just make the comment. I don't know that we've fully aligned on a view that says we're totally in favour of a national scheme here. I distinguish between, if you like, the law for one thing, and then its administration and enforcement on another area. There are advantages as having a consistent law, and there are some advantages in having sort of coordination between multiple regulators, if that's what we have in each jurisdiction. That latter seems to me the more likely outcome in this case, to be honest. I can't see us necessarily having one national regulator, but I don't think we've made any firm decisions on this. It's an issue we're still to get submissions on and to have discussion among the panel on before we align to any particular view of the world in that regard.
Heather, did you want to add anything? Okay.
Great, thank you. And before I ask the next question, I might just remind people of the time. We've got just under 8 minutes left. So if you have any burning questions, use this opportunity to put them into the Q&A box there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And even if we don't get a chance to get to your question before 2 o'clock, we will follow up out of session. So use that Q&A function that's available to you. The next question is, is that one of the risks that might arise from including providers that house social tenants in this regime is that these providers might choose to exit the market rather than deliver services at a higher standard. How might the regime address this risk?
It's a really good question. I'll give you a very interesting answer. So in some of the consultations that we've had with private landlords, we had one of them that talked about having as a tenant a single parent who was routinely late with their rental payments. And what happened that the estate agent, just out of the blue, hired somebody from a social housing provider in Queensland who'd moved down to Melbourne. And that person who'd been trained up in social housing had immediately struck up a conversation with the tenant, and they found a way to make sure that she paid her rent on time, and it gave the landlord better understanding of that tenant. So it's what was a vulnerable tenancy became a sustainable one. And guess who was very happy about that? The landlord was very happy. The other bit of feedback that we've had from private investors, when we've talked about a tenant-focused regulatory structure, they said, hey, that would be fantastic for us, because one of the best indicators of whether it's a good investment is how stable the tenancy is. High turnover of tenants is a bad indicator. It indicates a system that's not working very well and probably not worthy of investment. So I think probably another way of looking at it is that could you design some sort of regulatory system that, rather than scaring people away, actually attracted people to it and made it better over the longer term? It's an interesting question also about what services are provided. The Productivity Commission has raised this, that you've got 1/5 of that broader social tenant category in social housing. Could you think of ways of providing other support services for people who aren't in social housing? What could you do to maybe make those tenancies more sustainable for a better life for all people? So that would be the way that we'd be thinking about it. Now, if you got that right, you know what? You might end up with not fewer providers, but more. Now, having said that, it might be that there are some providers who go, we don't want to do that. Well, you know what? It may be that for those people to leave, that's not a bad thing, because they're not going to be providing the services needed by social housing tenants. So it's that sort of delicate balancing act. But we would prefer to think that what we're doing is working to try and strengthen the system rather than weaken it.
Thank you, David. And it's just so great, I think, for all our members to be listening to this and just getting an insight into, and how you're thinking through these kind of complex issues. The next question is around young people, and the comment is, some renters on extremely low income, such as youth allowance recipients or asylum seekers, may not be seen as ideal tenants for community housing providers. How will these renters be supported by the new regulatory scheme?
Another great question. Heather, would you like to respond to that one?
Yeah, it is a good question, and it's sort of very linked to that rent setting question, isn't it? Because it's the ability to pay problem. And I'm aware of some really well-designed projects for those groups. And so I suppose one of the things I would hope we can do is set things up for a sector that's able to notice unmet need and design housing responses for that. But I'm a realist. I mean, people know I've been in this housing game a long time. It is finding those subsidies is a real issue, and that won't, whatever we do with regulation, won't get around that sort of problem as well, which is kind of a policy and funding problem in line. But at least from a regulatory point of view, we can hopefully enable the sort of innovation and thinking that will go part way.
Thanks for that response. David, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, look, just as another thought that we had, I think it was last week, Unison Housing had a terrific forum looking at sustainable tenancies, where they were drawing on the research of their housing lab that had looked at the administrative data for Unison Housing, and they looked at different categories of renter within Unison Housing to see who is there after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 2 years. Now, if you take, for example, men aged over 56 versus people who have just come out of prison, who do you think are most likely to be there after 2 years? Well, it's not the the ex-prisoner population. They're more likely to have exited. Many of them will be back in prison. Seen in that light, if you don't ask questions like the sort of this one that's been asked and start trying to shed some light on this question, you give implicitly a strong incentive for providers not to look after the needs of those people who are going to turn over more quickly or require intensive support. On the other hand, if you shed light on it, those who are doing a fantastic job at sustaining those tenancies should be recognised. So one of the things I suspect that we'll be turning our attention somewhere a lot down the track is measures of sustainable tenancies and different types of renter to try and make sure that people aren't excluded by virtue of their characteristics that add costs to community housing or social housing providers.
Great, thank you. Now we're just going to squeeze in one last question. We've got 2 minutes to go. So the last question is that public housing estates have particular cultures and established communities that support their residents. How will community housing providers be encouraged to build inclusive communities in their properties?
David or Heather, over to you.
Well, let me just say, I think you're telling us that that's important.
Yeah.
Aren't you? We agree that community, proper good housing is more than just the four walls. So tell us more about how you think that could happen. And that's a good reminder. And it's the people living in estates, but it's also people living in spot purchase type setups as well. Whether the whole thing is a success or not does very much depend on those community interactions and two-way interactions. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, right on time, 1:59. So just thank you so much to our panel members, David Hayward, Heather Holst, David Cousins. Thank you to the excellent Angelina Yannicelli as well. It's just been fantastic to have you with us today. Thank you for making this such a kind of a transparent and engaging process. And thanks to our amazing community sector colleagues who've made this such a great event through your fantastic questions. Please, please, please do get involved in writing submissions, engaging. As David said at the beginning of this session, it can feel really overwhelming just hearing the words regulation, regulatory review, but you all have incredible expertise and the panel really wants to hear from you. So please get involved. Thanks again for taking the time to attend this event. A reminder to take a few moments to complete the event survey when it pops up on your screen in a moment. A full transcript and captioned video recording of this event will be available in a few days, and we'll send you an email when it's ready. We'll get to any questions that we didn't get to today. Please follow VCOSS on social media, sign up to our email alerts to learn about future events like this one. Really just want to thank the excellent team working with the panel. I want to thank the fantastic VCOSS team. So thank you to Karen Taranto and Amy Houston for bringing this to life. It's been a wonderful afternoon. So thank you to everyone, and we will see you again soon. Stay safe and well, and please complete the survey as it pops up on your screen. Thanks, everyone.